Welcome to the 334th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today I talk with Esther Lieberman Cuenca about teaching medieval history in the COVID era. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID Calls live on weekdays at its new time of 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. Please also feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, September 6, 2021, there are 4,569,193 deaths from COVID-19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. There are other statistics we might like to know about COVID-19, and I will turn to that in a few minutes when I join my conversation with my guest. Been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. Louisiana police lieutenant and dad of 3 dies of COVID-19 day before his wedding. Lieutenant Dunn leaves behind 3 children ages 1, 5, and 13. This appeared on ABC News by Emily Shapiro. Marcus Dunn, a police lieutenant and community mentor in Baker, Louisiana, died of COVID-19 one day before his wedding. Lieutenant Dunn, 36, succumbed to the virus on August 13th, leaving behind 3 children ages 1, 5, and 13, said Baker Police Chief Carl Dunn, who is also a cousin of Lieutenant Dunn. Lieutenant Dunn and his fiancée were initially set to get married in July of 2020, but postponed the ceremony to August 14, 2021, due to the pandemic, Carl Dunn told ABC News. She's lost without him, Carl Dunn said. Lieutenant Dunn was an Air Force veteran who spent his free time coaching and mentoring local children, the chief said. For Lieutenant Dunn, it was personal. His father was killed when he was a child, and all of his positive role models were coaches, so he felt a responsibility to give back, the chief said. He just wanted to always be in these children's lives and be a positive impact, Carl Dunn said. His fiancée, she really understood that that's where his heart was, and that's what kept him satisfied, giving back. On July 29th, Lieutenant Dunn told the chief he tested positive for COVID-19. Lieutenant Dunn was not vaccinated, Carl Dunn said, adding that his cousin did not tell him why he chose not to get the shot and that it was not a requirement for the police department. It was disturbing to me that he hadn't gotten it. I didn't know for sure he hadn't gotten it until it was all over with, Carl Dunn said. Lieutenant Dunn's symptoms were coughing, a headache, and trouble breathing at first, but Carl Dunn said he talked to him every day and he always sounded upbeat. Even the day that he went on the ventilator, I talked to him that morning and he told me that he wasn't feeling bad, the chief said. Lieutenant Dunn went on a ventilator on August 10th and never came off it, leaving Carl Dunn in shock. I know he was a fighter and strong-willed, he said. I just keep telling myself he was going to make it. And I also kept assuring the family that I knew he was going to make it. The mayor of Baker, Darnell Waits, said in a statement, "My heart is heavy since learning of the passing of DeMarcus Dunn. He was a father, husband, soldier, mentor, friend, and veteran Baker police officer, a man loved by all," Waits said. His life spent dedicated in service to others was a shining example for our community. Added Carl Dunn, "We lost a wonderful person and a wonderful community servant. He had a sense of being responsible. He wanted to be the one to make a positive change." Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today, and let me introduce my guest, Esther Lieberman Cuenca. Esther Lieberman Cuenca is an assistant professor of history at the University of Houston, in Victoria, Texas. She teaches courses in world, European, American, and medieval history, and has published widely on pedagogy. She recently edited a special cluster of essays for the journal Europe Now, which is published by the Council of European Studies at Columbia University. The piece is on, and the special issue is on teaching medieval history in the COVID era. Esther Lieberman-Cuenca, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start the way I generally do, finding out what the pandemic looks like where you are. So what's the situation there?
Okay, so there's two different types of situations. There's at the community level here in Victoria, and then there's just Texas. I'm gonna have to admit to you, I don't always follow the numbers very closely because I find it very traumatic. I find it very sad. And I feel like the world is so tough around us that it's not something that I constantly follow. But I do get on Facebook, at least, I subscribe to the local paper, which is the Victoria Advocate, and every day they post like what's the new case numbers and what's the death rate and all that. So I do get it in, even though I might a little bit avoid it because it's so sad to me. But right now in Victoria, Texas. Just so that I can situate all of your audience members in Victoria. Victoria, Texas is called the Crossroads of Texas. We're in South Texas. We are about 2 hours away from Houston, 2 hours from San Antonio, 2 hours from Austin, 2 hours from Corpus Christi, give or take, in either direction. That's why we're called the Crossroads. Victoria is the county seat of Victoria County. It is definitely the biggest city in the region and in the county, but it's not saying much. It's about 60 to 65,000 people here. The vaccination rate is not wonderful. There is about a 47% vaccination rate in Victoria, in the city of Victoria, Texas, and the cities around us in Victoria County, which are much less populated, also have about that number, although there's 2 cities or so that are up to 52%. So the vaccination rate is not great. There's about roughly 1 death per week. That's been the rolling 7-day average, and about 72 cases per week. In Texas, Texas has been a real hotspot, and from what I can tell from the maps, at least that are provided by the New York Times, the hotspot doesn't the real hotspot in Texas doesn't necessarily seem to be South Texas, where I'm at, but more like in the Dallas area. But still, Texas is a horrible place for more reasons than one right now, and it's pretty bad. It's about 19,000 infections per week, and about 250 deaths per week. So it's real bad. We have a governor who is not helping matters, who governs in a way that reminds me a little bit of President Trump from last year, kind of in denial. Like we're not gonna do anything proactive to protect you. We're not going to mandate masks. You cannot ask about vaccination requirements. And I'm mentioning the governor because that has an effect on my workplace. I work for the state, and so we are tied to what this governor mandates or doesn't mandate. So that has made it more difficult for us to. We can't enforce masking. We can't. We run a vaccination clinic out of the university, and we give incentives for students to get vaccinated, but that doesn't mean that they need to do it. So I think we have been trying our best to deal with a very bad situation here, where people are very careless, where there is minimal masking, but it's just about like survival every day. And I've found ways. I have found ways to apply a little bit of social pressure for my students to wear masks when they're in the classroom with me. At least I think I've kind of figured that out in the last week. But other than that, it's been pretty horrible, and because there is no real leadership here.
Can you say a little bit about the way that conversation unfolds in a classroom in a state with a low vaccination rate and a governor who has literally banned what most people would consider common sense public health measures to be taken in a crowded space, and there you are in front of the classroom? How does that work?
Okay, so I'm not sure whether what I have done is going to last for the rest of the semester. We started classes August 23rd. So really, we've really, this week is really our third week of classes. But this is what I have done. Um, I have written emails, like email blasts, like please do not forget to wear your mask. If you feel like you cannot wear a mask, then this class is streaming simultaneously. Please take it from your dorm room or from your house. So that's I always say, like, you have options. The other thing that I do, I always remind them that vaccination is free. One of the things that I have found, being in this kind of small city in Texas, is that a lot of people don't get vaccinated, not necessarily because they are like they're anti-vaccine. So I mean, some of them are like that, but some of them just don't know. Like they don't really know what a vaccine is, or they don't know it's free. They don't know that, like, you can walk into Walgreens and get it. So part of that is just making sure that that you don't have to pay for this. Like, you just have to go, and it's like really quick. So I always remind them of that, of emails. Now, when we actually get into the class, this is what I've been doing. I bring a stack of masks with me. I bring the N95 mask, and I bring more of the, the blue ones that are a bit more flimsy, but it's something. And when a student comes in who's not masked, and I have to say now it's a minority of students because I'm so forceful over email. I always say you're not legally required, but please, for my safety, I put myself in, myself in email for that. But once in a while, I'll have a student come in who's not masked, and I don't say, hey, would you like to wear a mask? I give them the option. Would you like the blue mask, or would you like this N95? And you do it in front of the classroom. Yeah. And oftentimes, they're not offended or anything. They're like, oh yeah, I forgot. And, they'll grab a mask from you, or they'll think about it, like, oh, I think I want that one. So it's not like, hey, do you want to do this today? It's like, you're going to do this today, but here you can do it in two different ways. And so that's how I have solved the issue of masking. And now I have 100% masking in my classroom, but that's because I have used, this is not the right word, but the bully pulpit or the gentle pulpit. Like I go and like do it in front of the class. Sure. Like, here are your masks. So that's how I have solved it. But that shouldn't be up to me. There should be a mandate that all students who want to attend class do have to wear masks, and they don't have to put that burden on me. But it is on me, and that's what I have figured out.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I mean, you are their teacher. So, I mean, there is that aspect of this I feel has been overlooked. It's like, it's not like teachers, I mean, aside from everything else that's going on, teachers have an important duty to students to actually share facts with them. Sometimes those facts are what's in the textbook, and I'm in the op-ed box right here, but and sometimes those facts are about how the world works and how to keep themselves safe. And university professors also have unique responsibilities, particularly with freshmen, but not only, who may be away from home for the first time, living in settings that they hadn't lived in before. Another thing I wanted to note about what you said, and we can really picture it the way you described it, will you be having the N95 or you be having the blue today, is that even in states that have mask mandates, I hear from faculty who are having to do something similar, because just because the mandate is there doesn't mean students remember. I mean, they forget their adapters, they forget their umbrella. We all do. Yeah. And so to de-escalate that from something where all of a sudden it's like, let's have an ideological confrontation this morning, to let's just all, not kill each other. It seems like the right way to go to me, Esther.
Yeah, listen, most of them mean well. And I made it very clear that I would not necessarily welcome an unmasked person, and that you have an option if you would like to remain unmasked. So that's how I dealt with it. I also, we also have to understand that, like, students have come here to learn from you. Like, they don't need to be embarrassed by you. Like, I put social but I don't embarrass them. I go like, hey, did you forget? Like, here's some masks, here's some options. I make it very casual, so they don't feel bad about it or anything. Another thing that I should mention is that the student population that I teach is is a working class community. They are mostly students of color. I teach in what we call a federally designated HSI, a Hispanic Serving Institution. And to qualify for that federal designation, you need to have a population of at least 25% of students need to be Hispanic. I think UHV has 43%. We have a pretty large proportion of our student body is also African American. We have a smaller proportion of Asian. So really, white students are, in a sense, a kind of minority at my institution. My institution also tends to have older students, students who have been in the working world or combining their work life with going to classes. So they their average age is higher than 22. It also tends to be predominantly female. Sometimes this depends on the major, what have you, but on overall, so the student body is tends to be overwhelmingly female, tends to be older, and tends to be Hispanic, and they are most importantly first generation. So they don't necessarily have someone in their family from whom they get advice on how to just succeed in college. Like we are teaching them that. And my parents are South American. We're an immigrant family as well. I'm first generation American, but my mom went to college in Chile, and my dad he came to this country when he was 16, and he went to the University of California, Irvine, and got an engineering degree. So I am not first generation college student, and so even though we never really had long conversations about college, I kind of knew what to expect when I got to college. That is not necessarily the case with these students. They come from a very different background. So they don't know a lot about like classroom etiquette or anything like that. And they're learning. You just have to be patient. They're not, students are never they never want to be malicious or anything like that. And that's you just have to come from a place of understanding.
Getting a snapshot inside the classroom at the University of Houston, Victoria, from Professor Esther Lieberman Cuenca on COVID calls. And Esther, let me ask you a question I've been asking all my guests lately. If you wouldn't mind sharing a memory that you have of this COVID time. I'm sure you have more than one, but something that really resonates for you that's sort of particular to this time.
So a lot of my historical work, by the way, just so everyone knows, I'm going to get this out of the way. I am not a historian of medicine or disease. I'm a medieval historian, yes, but I had, prior to COVID, I had very little exposure to the history of medicine and disease and history of science and all of that. And I have given myself over the year a crash course. We'll get to that a little bit more. I'm a legal historian by training. I'm a medieval historian. And when I was hired at UHV, I was hired out of graduate school, and I started in August of 2019. And I had like about a semester of like a normal semester, not really normal because I was still settling into a new institution. I was still getting to know my colleagues. I had about a one normal-ish semester, and in the spring, COVID hit. So I have been in Texas since August of 2019, in my very first time in Texas, because I'm originally from California. And I've barely had a time to really really get settled here. Everything has been in this kind of crisis mode. And as a historian of customary law, of legal memory and all that, I'm very interested in how we talk about memory and how we store memory and how we in how historical sources can be evidence of public memory, of private memory. I'm interested in all those issues. So I was reading a lot about memory during the time of COVID and the things that we remember. And most articles that I am reading are like everything is hard to remember. Everything is very traumatic, but then also everything is hard to remember because everything like blends together. It's very hard to pick out the things that are necessarily meaningful, because what we do in our daily lives doesn't really just pop out. So I would have to say that what has popped out for me as someone who just moved to Texas, who doesn't really know this state at all, was the times that I got to leave Victoria during the pandemic. Because I teach at the University of Houston, Victoria. I've never been to Houston. I've been to the airport, but I've never been to Houston. I've never,
Wow.
because I haven't
Right,
had
right.
time I've been in Victoria. So when I went to San Antonio, because I replaced the countertop of my kitchen. So when I had to go to the slab yard in San Antonio, it was my first time ever in San Antonio. I went to a slab yard. It wasn't exciting, but that sticks out in my mind. I have an acquaintance in Austin. That was my first time going to Austin. So I met up with my acquaintance, and he's an Austin native, and we went around that river. We walked outside, and then I went home. Because all the times where I get to go outside of Victoria is what sticks out. I very briefly went to when it looked like we were beating this thing before Delta came on the scene. I went to California, and I saw my mother for like the first time in like 2 years or something like that. And I was so happy. And I saw my nephews. So that obviously sticks out in my mind. As a calm before the Delta storm. So it's things like that. It's when it interrupts the monotony of your memories, of your experiences. That is what sticks out. But those particular things are not necessarily like very special. It's just like, I go to a slab yard, I walked around a river, it's things like that.
Thank you for that. And so I'm born and raised in Texas. So fifth generation. So it's interesting to hear you describe your sort of first, trips outside of Victoria. Victoria is a place we always stop when we're on our way to the coast, coming from Central Texas. And it's not a normal first trip to Austin to like go meet a friend, go for a walk by the river and leave. Usually a trip to Austin involves live music and food and restaurants and the lively, and San Antonio the same. So, what you're describing is really, I think, iconic of this time. There's also something I just want to point to what you said, the density of the experience of this time, even though for many people it's been very mundane, being at home, disrupting the normal patterns, but it's still a dense set of experiences. And the problem of pulling one out is, I don't ask this as a trick question, but as a historian, you were on to me immediately, because this is, for historians, this is part of what we deal with in the past. Our historical sources don't say to us, they don't write a letter and say, having now considered the 2 years of this event, I'm going to tell you what my single strongest memory is. They're real people like us. And so they describe the density of their experience, and then we have to try to decide how to prioritize those. And that's great historians are experts in the mundane, I think. And so I really like the way you addressed that. And you said, and your proviso that you're not a medieval historian of medicine is well noted. We've had a lot of them on COVID calls. I am also not, and I'm also not trained in the history of medicine. So, and listeners know that. So I'm learning as much as anybody else. So having said that, let's find out about your research. We'll talk about the teaching too in a minute. Before coming into the COVID-19 era, what was most of your research about?
Oh God, it's going in all sorts of different directions. I'm the person who looks at the shiny object and I go follow it. That's basically what I'm doing now. At my core, I'm a legal historian. I'm a medieval English historian. I specialize in urban history and in town law is my thing. And I'm currently writing a book. The manuscript is under review, but I'm currently writing a book on the development and evolution of town law in medieval English towns. It's a really, really big project. So that will always, I think, be my primary identity. But a secondary identity that I have developed is a historian of popular culture. So I really examine these questions of medievalism, which is the popular representation of the Middle Ages in our modern era, and that can come through media such as like film and music. I just published an article on the medievalisms of the music in Game of Thrones in the journal Popular Music. I have talked about like the deployment of this word blood libel in American political culture. And I used the Sarah Palin thing in 2011 as a kind of flashpoint to discuss that. So I talk a lot about like how the Middle Ages comes up in political discourse, how it comes up in film and music and that kind of thing. So my, besides my, I guess I had a little bit of an interest of like how medieval death and disease comes out in popular media. I did, before all the COVID thing, I did have a little bit of an interest in that, but my interests were very, very far away from medicine and disease. I was kind of dealing in those kind of worlds, popular culture and law and all of that. And I realized that COVID, the way that I tend to want to understand myself, and I understand the world around me, and I think you'll know what I'm talking about, is I understand it historically. That's the reason why I'm a historian. That is how I process information. And COVID was such a friggin' trauma when it hit. How it completely disrupted my career here, my building a community, that I wasn't able to go visit family. The only way that I was able to process it was to offer a class on the history of pre-modern disease and not really medicine, but on pre-modern diseases and pandemics, because that's how I felt that I was going to get through it. I was like, you know what? I can sit down and I can learn this stuff. I've never ever planned to offer a class like this, but I need it, and I think the students need it too. And this is how we're going to process this experience. We're going to process it historically.
So you were able to pivot early in the pandemic to offering a class on pre-modern pandemics?
So we, as you know, the pandemic hit us in March. We all went. It hit us right before spring break. So we were given the spring break to put all our classes online. This is a experience that was very common to maybe 100% of us in U.S. institutions. So that all happened, and I had a very particular way that I did that. That was just like, plugging holes in the leaky ship. I did something like very rudimentary on Blackboard. I did not do live classes, what have you. But I was thinking that I have the summer. I am not going anywhere in the summer because I am stuck here. And I am just going to go, I'm going to work on my other writing projects, but I'm going to go full hog on this pandemics class. I constructed an entire source book for my class, which I took from, because what I was trying to, the class that I developed that I ended up teaching that fall of 2020, I didn't really see a class like it. It was not just disease and pandemics. I also I did a week on disabilities and disfigurement. I also wasn't just doing the Middle Ages. Yes, it centers very much on the Middle Ages because we're going to spend a lot of time on the Black Death and the first outbreak of the second pandemic. But I also wanted to go back to the ancient Near East. I want to go to prehistoric times. I wanted to examine, where diseases come from. We went to we looked at sources from ancient Rome as well. So it was, and then we also went into the modern period too a little bit. So it was a long. The title of the class was a special topics in like medieval pandemics, but in reality, it was a longue durée history. And yes, a lot of it spent time in the Middle Ages, but that's not all we did. And so I really couldn't find a comparable, like a complementary source book for that. So I grabbed a bunch of sources from different places that I could find, and I cobbled it together in like one big, like 70-page PDF. And that became our textbook for the class.
Wow. So just want to underline what you said a moment ago about making sense of this time by teaching it, which is a unique opportunity for teachers, and it also, I think it's important to note that your perspective here is incredibly valuable because your training is in other aspects of life in the Middle Ages, and so you then brought in what you needed to know to be able to talk about the Black Death, let's say, for example, or trace that back to the ancient world. Maybe you could just say a little bit more about your preparation there, because it's like almost unlimited. I mean, seems to me, I mean, it's an almost unlimited number of recent volumes. I mean, it's a very lively area of scholarship, which I'm happy to see, and I think it will be even more so. How does one sit down and begin to prepare to teach the Black Death?
Um, well, I don't start off the class in the Black Death. We go to like Babylonian times and just look at like chants that were. This is in Winston Black's medicine source book, which I took. I borrowed a few sources from that. If you have not had Winston Black on your channel, you definitely should. He's amazing. I also assigned one of his podcasts in my class where he was comparing COVID with the Black Death. But because primarily his source book dealt with medicine, and I wasn't really dealing with medicine in the class, it was more like disease and pandemics and like how society kind of dealt with it in their own way. I only took a few sources from, but he has a really like a lot of ancient stuff in that. So I took a few from there and stuff that I could just find in open source places. And I think because we are dealing, even today, we're dealing with diseases that are ancient, that are very hard to actually put the origin point to them. And because diseases don't really have temporal boundaries, that's why I kind of went all over the place. Like we would cover thousands of years. But to prepare something like the Black Death, you don't start with the Black Death. You start with other types of diseases that kind of start to pop up in the historical record. And these are mostly, you can find them in kind of sources about medicine, in Greek sources about medicine, but you could also find them in like chronicles, even like histories from antiquity that describe death and disease coming to a community. And I think one of the popular things that historians of medicine what they used to do was that they would try to read these pre-modern sources and try to like figure out, okay, what disease were they really talking about? Like they're describing all of these symptoms. Is this typhus? And I think what a cool thing that has happened in the way that historians of medicine disease talk about it is that they don't try to find like it could be typhus, but that's besides the point. It's really just like how this how this pre-modern writer is thinking about it, how they're kind of framing it in this in the way that it affected their society, and what kind of moralizing discourses come from it. And I think that's the more interesting part of it. Not like, oh, he says A, B, and C symptoms, so it must be this. I think historians of medicine disease are a lot more sophisticated than that. But of course, the students want to know that too. So sometimes you just have to like riff with them on that. So something like the Black Death, you can't start with the second pandemic. You have to go to the first pandemic. And then and then even before you go to the first pandemic, which broke out, basically during the time of Justinian, the emperor. And sometimes it's called the Justinian plague because of that. You can't even start with the first pandemic. You have to like discuss with students, okay, where do diseases and pandemics come from? And that's, and there you're going into prehistory. So to even get up to the Black Death, you have to, I spent a couple weeks on the first pandemic, and then a couple weeks before that, just on ancient disease. And the Cambridge, the biggest Cambridge history of medicine is a really, really good resource for all of that. Because again, I'm not necessarily a historian of medicine or disease, and I also don't have a great science background. I do have a PhD in history, but I do not have a 10th grade education in science. I'm a high school dropout. So very basic things about biology, I never had the education about. So it's very important to me that I read things that are written for lay people like me, where I have very minimal understanding of science, but I can understand it and then teach it to my students.
So let's talk a little bit more about the class and the way that students reacted. Here we have students, I'm guessing mostly non-majors, although I could be wrong.
Yeah.
You said special topics class, so any student can find this topic, and in the middle of the pandemic, I can imagine why they're interested. You wrote about this in your essay for Europe Now, in this cluster of essays, and you talked about what it was like to be in that classroom. And I'm just going to actually share one little bit of what you wrote.
Mhm.
You talked about an assessment you gave, a test, and a writing prompt. And in the prompt, you said, and the language of this is going to sound familiar to anybody who's taken a history class, identify 3 types of primary sources that historians use to
Mhm.
analyze the Black Death, the bubonic plague, and explain their particular worth in illuminating the human and social experiences of the plague. And then you gave a bonus, an extra credit. What parallels do you see between how medieval and modern governments handle
Mhm.
epidemics? So what were the answers?
So let me give a little bit more background. So the class that I was just describing, like the disease and pandemics in the pre-modern world, I guess if you could give it that title, it's just special topics. That class was taught in fall 2020. That had an enormous amount of prep work that was done by me. I did a whole source book, and that was taught synchronously, kind of like this. That prompt that you just read out was a prompt that I came up with in like almost the last minute when we had broke in spring 2020 for pandemic. So what I had to do is I had to put the entire class online. And our LMS, our learning management service, is Blackboard, which is very clunky and horrible, but that's what I have. And my concerns when the pandemic hit in March was, and at the time I was teaching a world history course, World History Part 1, which covers the origins of humanity to roughly the year 1500. My concerns with that course is that I didn't know what my students were going through. So what I did with that course and what I did with my US history course, the survey, was that when I put it online, we did not have synchronous sessions like this. We had like 6 weeks or 7 weeks left of class left. So I gave them like prompts to like that they had to write on, like just like paper prompts, and then they submitted a paper once a week. So it was very chill. Like they watched some videos, they read some things on their own time within the week, and then they turned something in on Monday. That's the strategy that I came up with in like the emergency time of like COVID teaching when I didn't have anything prepared. And that prompt you read was me like already getting the idea of that, okay, I'm going to have to bring in the Black Death. I actually wasn't really going to talk about the Black Death in world history. There's so many other topics you need to cover. I think I was going to do half a class on it. But there has to be interest from the students, right? I mean, medieval Black Death hot takes were coming in quick, in those early days of COVID. And so, and if you read the other essays in the cluster, like Maria Americo's essay from, she's an assistant professor at St. Peter's. She had written that she was teaching this class, and like a Western Civ class, I don't know what it was, forgetting. And she wasn't going to do the Black Death. And suddenly all the students wanted to know about the Black Death. So I anticipated that was going to be their response. So I'm like, how do I do this in like an easy way in which they kind of like get it right away? So I looked at the types of documentaries that were available for our students that we have access to through our streaming service. And there's a documentary called The Return of the Black Death, which was produced in 2014 by the BBC. It's very England-centric. I would have preferred something global, but that's not the option I had. And I watched the documentary. I'm like, okay, this could be really interesting. And this was obviously produced during the Ebola. So it brought it kind of to like our modern era, and it shows like how diseases spread with like a focus on the Black Death. And one of the things that I generally do in my classes, whether it's a class on the Black Death or not, is that when I assign a documentary, I always ask questions where the students think about how the documentary is put together. That if we are taking this as a secondary source, we have to analyze how the documentary filmmakers are deploying those primary sources for a mass audience. And I would argue that assigning documentaries or maybe other narrative films is incredibly important pedagogical tool, because your students, I'm sorry to say, are not going to remember the primary sources they read. But you know what they will remember? They will remember that weird movie that they saw in your class 3 years ago or 5 years ago. So there's this this was, available in our educational service, a Return of the Black BBC produced documentary. So it was very slick or what have you. And I noticed that, as I noticed with all documentaries, like how they put information together. So the students, because we had been talking about primary sources for the entire semester until we broke for the COVID, they did very well. They noticed that, okay, the documentarians, they used wills. I mean, it's mostly, medieval English wills because it was centered on medieval England. They use bioarchaeological data. They look at, skeletons from plague pits or burial pits. There's a letter that they read from a king, about, the death of his daughter who died of plague. So that, like, letters, chronicles, things like that. So those are the types of things that I wanted them to notice. But I also wanted them to notice how these pieces of evidence that we historians write about, how they can be put on film and arranged in such a way that is appealing to a mass audience. That's what I wanted them to get out of that.
So, well, thank you for that explanation, and that point you made there about the narrative being what will stick in lots of cases, but also that's an opportunity for historians to sort of pull back on that and show students how these narratives are constructed, and that even with I've done that teaching the history of the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War. And just take a 5-minute segment, let students watch Ken Burns. So I intentionally use Ken Burns.
Yeah.
And then say, okay, now watch it and write down every primary source you see in that 5 minutes. Well, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And then you turn them loose. And then you've ruined watching films for them. Because, I mean, the way historians, it's hard to watch films with us. Because then after that, they're always going to be looking for how the construction works and what the source material is. Just coming back to the essay that you wrote, and I put the link up here to it. People should be able to find this, discussing the title "Medieval Echoes in Modern Experiences of the COVID-19 Pandemic." But one particular answer really kind of drew you up short from one of your students, and I'll just again just read one sentence here. One student answered, "The only countries that are prepared and doing things right are the countries run by women. Our government should have been more proactive and planned for such a debacle to happen." So this is in the middle of the pandemic. It's there on the page, coming from a student. What was your reaction to that?
It was certainly the most colorful reaction, because most of the students, this is spring when everything was disrupted very in this very dramatic way. All the students were fairly ho-hum in their responses. They just kind of answered it straight up. This student was this is so very much our demographic, right? She was older. She actually had children, or older children. And this was her, I remember asking her when we were still meeting face to face before the pandemic hit. I remember asking her, is it very inconvenient for you to come to campus? And she's like, "No, I live for it. Like I'm with my kids all day. Like I love history." She was a history major. I love it. I want to, this is my respite from home. And so I get this answer from her, which she had submitted on Blackboard for the weekly paper thing that I was doing. And I get where she was coming. She was frustrated. She was like, "I was having such a good time. Not necessarily just in my class, but just in general, going to campus, finishing her education. And this thing had completely screwed her up. She lost her job. And I think she was working at the time at a restaurant, and she had lost her job. So she didn't have that. And she was, I think she got to that prompt as she was frustrated, and she kind of let it all out on the page. Not directed at me, but like just directed at the situation. One of the things I also asked, how do you compare, like the documentary had showed, like, how Londoners tried to prepare for the onslaught of the plague, and actual kind of proactive things that the government was at the time was trying to do to deal with the Black Death in their own way. And so I asked them to compare that to maybe what they're seeing around her. And that's when she wrote the whole thing about the women, because at the time in March of 2020, it seemed like the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and Angela Merkel were the only ones who knew what they were doing. They really like we had a president who was in denial, and I wanted them to think about that, because being in denial about a pandemic has never ended well, and it's also not normal. Like, this is like our reaction, like Donald Trump going in and like one day, like saying things like one day it'll go away. Like, I wanted them to know that this kind of carelessness is not leadership, and people have been, leaders in the past, and they are leaders today. But that was not leader, and I wanted them to see what dire straits we were in, because because pandemic, yes, we have to work as a community, but it's also about leadership and who's kind of handling the response to that. And we were in deep shit. Sorry, can I cuss? I don't know.
Yeah.
we were in, like, if we were already in deep shit, like by March 2020 with the Trump presidency or the Trump administration, but we really realized what in massive deep shit we were with having that guy at the head of the response. And I think the students realized that, and she especially realized it, and I think that's where it came out.
Is that a way that history then, because we always hear about how history, I think we hear too much about how going back to those historical cases will provide us the lessons we need to get out of a current problem. And I'm worried about that, as if, historians just always have a sort of ready-made playbook from the past to offer to current policymakers, and hey, yeah, just follow 1, 2, and 3. But pulling on cases from the past, resonances and contexts that do resemble current problems, like you said, if you're framing it as a problem of leadership or a problem of knowledge or a problem of a gendered society, those are powerful examples for students to find. And my experience is they find sometimes a pessimism there that, wow, why do we just keep repeating these same kinds of patterns? But in other cases, I find students pull much more complicated things out of the historical record. They pull one that struck me as I was teaching in the pandemic, was the way that people coped with loss in the past, that the historical record was actually a reservoir of empathy for them.
Yeah.
And so they weren't looking for like, well, how do we get rid of a bad leader? They were looking for like, how do people deal with loss in the past? And that was a useful thing for them as well. I don't know how your students, reacted to those examples.
Yeah.
This one strong example, which is quite useful. What else?
Oh, exactly what you mentioned. In the fall class, in the actual not the spring class, which was disrupted, and I had this video that I watched that I had them watch. But in the actual structured pandemic class, the sources from my source book that I gave them, the ones that resonated the most were ones that dealt with emotion, that allowed them to empathize. And listen, sometimes, especially pre-modern sources, they can be weird. They're very removed from our experiences, and that's okay. And that's what I am. I'm not a historian of medicine or disease, but that's one thing that I'm very good at. I'm a pre-modernist. I know how to read these sources, whatever topics they are, and I can shepherd the students through a better understanding of context, which is incredibly important to counteract this narrative of like history repeating itself, or which is something that is that all too many students believe, at least until they take my class, or this idea that we're gonna take these lessons from the past and apply them to the future. I think students, once they take a more advanced college history class, it's not in a Texas high school classroom taught by a coach. No offense to coaches. They realize that there's a more of a sophisticated way of understanding these things. So that's my job. I can lead them through the foreign context of what is the pre-modern world sometimes. But when it comes to actual sources that show suffering, that show how people are dealing with loss, how they grieve, that was really powerful stuff. And there was an assignment that I had in the pandemics course in the fall, where I had students present on a primary source, which is found in Rosemary Horrocks's book on sources on the Black Death, which is very Europe-centric. That's what, again, that's why I couldn't assign her book, is because we were going beyond the Black Death and we were also going beyond Europe. But I did assign her book, and I gave each student a source, and I assigned them a source that I thought might interest them. Like, I got to know them, and there was one student who wanted to be pre-med, so I gave her a pre-modern source on what the medical authorities at the time in the 14th century thought about the plague. So I thought that might be more up her alley. But there are sources of like people who are really who write about personal loss, either in a letter or in some other format. And those are the ones that really resonate with students. So when they presented to the class what they had found in this source, they kind of connected it to their own life. And that's something that, they don't need me at all for. That's something that they kind of work through, as far as kind of fine tuning their empathy for people who lived, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. That there is a continuity with when it comes to human experience.
Just a reminder that you're listening to COVID Calls, and we're talking today about teaching history in the time of COVID with Esther Lieberman Cuenca. And I want to just come back to your students. And you described at the top of our discussion today really well the demographic that you're serving there. And then the example of the student took the bonus question and really went with it, who had also shared with you her life experience. So can you zoom out a little bit on how students at University of Houston Victoria have coped with the pandemic, that accessibility issues, digital divide issues? Undoubtedly, as you said, the one student lost her job, and so now we're dealing with childcare. And I mean, every different aspect of this pandemic has hit working class people harder and people of color harder because of the divisions and fault lines that already exist in society that the pandemic reveals. I guess I'm curious, it's, you're not a social worker in the classroom, and yet one has to be pretty hardened not to empathize with and hear, at least hear the experiences of their students in a time like this. What did you learn? Or what, I guess, continuing to learn, because the students are still facing these hardships in many cases, I'm sure.
So you're right about the K-shape recovery, as we're calling it. Someone like me is going to be fine. I'm securely employed. I was very, very privileged enough to be one of the people to buy a house during COVID, and that partly, I didn't think it was going to be a big thing, buying houses. Like it's completely exploded. I bought a house here in Victoria, Texas, right at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't think I'd be able to buy a house now because the prices have gone up, but I did it right at the beginning of the pandemic. And the only reason I did so was because, there goes the job market once and for all. I'm lucky to have this job, and I am never leaving Victoria. And my prediction was that this pandemic was going to last for a long time. Donald Trump the Trump administration wasn't doing anything. This is going to ravage our communities, and I need a more permanent place to stay. So I was incredibly privileged to get a house and get more settled in Victoria and be in a job where I can do distance teaching and not put my body in danger. That is not the case for my students. For some of my students, their lives carried on much as the same before, but only with the added danger of catching a potentially deadly disease, because they work at Walmart, or they work at HEB, or they work at Buc-ee's, or some other place where they're considered as essential workers. So they needed to keep working, to survive. And then there were students like the young woman who had written that response, who I think was a waitress somewhere, or she did some other thing, and she lost her job. So it's been an incredibly mixed bag, but I think what you were saying is completely correct in that it is exacerbating class differences, whatever privileges I had before the pandemic have now only amplified after the pandemic. And for some students, like this kind of modality of teaching, I mean, University of Houston Victoria is like a lot of other regional universities, that there was already a robust online program, because that's how they're going to reach working adults. This was even before the pandemic. So that's always been part of the strengths of our university, and that worked really, really well for us as we went into 2020, 2021. We actually did not have an enrollment dip in that year. If anything, our enrollments went up. This year's a little bit different. Our enrollments are down, and it's a 13% down, which is an apocalyptic event to our administrators. But when I'm a face-to-face teacher, so when I moved online entirely in fall of 2020, and I was doing synchronous classes like this live, it was fantastic for students who were calling in from Houston, from Katy, from 2 hours away, who had jobs there, who could not come to the Victoria campus to take my world history course or to take whatever. It was great for them. For other students who are in the Victoria area, and who like going to face-to-face classes because they cannot physically learn in the online environment, it's just been disastrous for them. Like they can't focus. The demands of their work might be too large. Their whole home situation is chaotic, where they can't actually learn in a safe space or in a calm space. So to characterize one experience for a student is not the right way to go, because everyone has their own kind of situations. But what tends to be universal is that the students here are predominantly working class. They all have challenges. Some of these online things have made learning very accessible to them, and some of them have not. But they still have all these challenges all the same. And I think, if anything, COVID has made it a lot easier to just talk about personal stuff. So I am much more attuned to the kinds of challenges that my students have in this area. I don't think I would have been as conscious of their challenges had it not been for COVID, because it has really opened up the conversation just about our personal lives and what's going on.
What a time to get to know a community. As you said, you were there basically 6 months before the pandemic started and everything changed. So you didn't know the institution, didn't know the community, and you get to know it in this way.
Yeah. It's been in this limited way. What I do know, I really love my colleagues. I really like the students. But even that first semester, when things were normal, before the semester before the pandemic, it's very hard to do your first semester as an assistant professor anywhere. And I'm a medieval historian teaching a lot of U.S. history, because that's the demand that the Texas curriculum has. That's the bread and butter of the Texas curriculum. It's a reason why I have a job, but it's part of the thing that I need to do. So I was just trying to figure out how to teach U.S. history that first semester. I wasn't really getting to know anyone. I was writing new lectures. I was doing all these kind of things. And then when we entered spring 2020, I was teaching 2 sections of U.S. history again. I was like, okay, I'm getting it. I know what to do. I know how to relate to the student body. And then bam, the pandemic hit, and it's just not been the same.
So we're almost up on time, but I guess I'd like to ask you, looking forward a little bit, will you be teaching the pandemics class again? And if so, how will you change it, or what will be different? What did the teacher learn in terms of going forward?
So I just had a history. We don't have departments here; we have programs. I just had a history program meeting the other day, and I actually requested that I teach the pandemics class again this coming spring. I can't do it because it hasn't been 2 years since the last time I taught it. I taught it fall 2020, and I was requesting spring 2021, and my coordinator said no. So I'll be teaching the Crusades, also a class that I'm not a Crusades historian, but it's also, I think it's one of those Crusades is one of those topics that it's like the greatest hits. It's like if you're Led Zeppelin, that's your Led Zeppelin 4. You need to have
a Crusades class. Yeah, right.
You
Exactly.
need to have that Crusades class because that's going to attract a lot of interest. But I had wanted to do the reason why I asked to do the pandemics class again, and I put a formal request that it be entered into the catalog as a real class. I think I'm entering it as disease and pandemics in history. So it's not like a Europe or an Africa. It's just like all history. Right. Because when I taught it in fall of 2020, I think I had at most one class on vaccines. So my plan was that I need to do this class again because I worked very hard to prep this class the first time and I want to derive the benefits from that. But also I need to completely redo how I teach vaccines. And I think when I was doing it originally fall 2020, I was you could even ask my students how pessimistic I was. I'm like, we're never going to get a vaccine. We're never going to get one. Like there hasn't been a vaccine for a coronavirus. Like what makes you think like I was just negative, like everything was negative whenever someone had a conversation with me. And so I didn't cover like vaccines that much in the class. And also like my focus was talking about like how society deals with the effects of plagues and pandemics. So vaccines only took up like a class or so, but oh my God, was I going to change that for the spring? We were going to take maybe a week on vaccines. We were going to talk about, I did talk about this a little bit in the fall class, resistance to vaccine. I wanted to cover all of that. I wanted to have readings on vaccines. So I have big plans when I teach this class in the future. Probably not this school year, but the next school year I'll teach it again, and I'll have a different perspective because again, that's how my classes change with me. Like I process information, what's going on in the world, and then I propose a class, or that my existing class changes in some way. Much to sometimes the frustration of my colleagues who just want me to stick with one rotation and not, read a random article on South Asian queer women immigrants and decide that, oh, I'm interested in that and I'll just teach a class on that. That's kind of how I tend to I tend to just take the real world and turn it into a class. So, but the pandemic is still very, very much with us. Even though I can't teach the class again in the spring, I could probably teach it next fall. I'll do that, and it will reflect topics that are current, that deal with the pre-modern world, but that are reflective of our own time. And so, yeah, all of my classes change. I mean, that's how I process information.
Well, the Texas legislature is trying to ban, as far as I can tell, any teaching of African American history or the history of race in Texas public schools, but I think they're going to have a hard time banning, which is not going to work. But they're going to have a hard time banning the history of pandemic, although maybe they will try, and it will be fascinating to see. I mean, just to underline for people that you're teaching in a public institution, and so there's also that scrutiny, that political pressure and scrutiny. So what you decide to teach is not separable. You said, drawing from what's in the news today, which I totally admire, and I think students appreciate that a lot. But there's other things in the news too, in terms of where you are and how politicians think they should be in charge of what you get to do in the classroom. I don't know if that kind of politics makes it on the syllabus or not, but it's the broader atmosphere in which you're working.
Well, I mean, right now that conversation it affects my colleague Laura Mamina here, who's a Civil War historian, who's a historian of African American history, and my colleague Joe Locke, who's a Texas historian. It obviously has probably more effect on them, but I do teach U.S. history. I did ask. I remember at the beginning of semester, I know that this is like these laws are meant to target K through 12. Is this going to really, but we're at a public institution, so I didn't know. It seems like we are safe from that for now on. But the way that I see it is, I read that really good article by Timothy Snyder in the New York Times about memory laws. And I feel like this is it's like another type of memory law in which you are when you attempt to restrict what trained teachers and trained historians try to teach about the past. That is a type of memory law, not in the way that maybe we would necessarily traditionally think, in the way that Timothy Snyder was describing memory laws, having to do with like the Holocaust and things like that. But it is you're trying to shape the way that people remember the past. by restricting what our speech and the way that and our expertise. So I think that there's this kind of whole conservative preoccupation and movement towards like shaping history, because they know that history is a battleground. They know that that is where it's a site of identity formation. Obviously, literature classes, all other classes do that as well, sociology classes, but history especially, like when you find out how is it that how humanity has dealt with inequalities, how they have perpetuated inequalities. When you see that, and the continuity of that over time, that's a potentially radicalizing force. And conservative ideologues, they're not stupid in that sense. They know that. And so the best way to do that is to control it, to strike it from the classroom and from the history books. And I'm not sure that they're going to have a lot of success at UHV. But boy, are they going to try. They're having success in a lot of other things.
Just a reminder that you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can catch COVID Calls most weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Special announcement that on Tuesdays in the month of September, we're going to have a special guest host, Kristen Urquiza, who's the founder of Marked by COVID, and Kristen has been a guest multiple times on COVID Calls. So please do join us for that. Tomorrow on Tuesday at COVID Calls, we'll have Kristen Urquiza hosting. And I just want to thank my guest, Esther Lieberman Cuenca, for sort of opening up your memory of what it was like teaching in this time, but also how one goes about constructing a course in the middle of a disaster. Learned a lot from the conversation. Thanks, Esther.
Thanks for having me.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.